In the summer of 2008, the eyes of humanity turned toward the East. For centuries, China had been a mystery to the world, an empire of silks and shadows, of dynasties and revolutions, of ancient philosophies and new ambitions. But on the night of August 8, 2008, the mystery revealed itself, not in words but in light, sound, and motion. The world had never seen anything like it. At exactly 8:08 p.m., beneath a sky of smog and fireworks, the Beijing National Stadium, the bird's nest, came alive. 1 billion television screens flickered, and in every corner of the planet, people watched as thousands of drummers beat in perfect unison, their hands striking glowing drums like a single heartbeat. That night, China did not simply open the Olympic Games. It announced its arrival as a new kind of power. For the International Olympic Committee, Beijing 2008 was a gamble. Just a decade earlier, China had been seen as a developing nation, closed, cautious, and complex. There were doubts, criticism, protests. Some questioned the decision to host the Games in a country with such political control. Others feared chaos, pollution, and human rights controversies. But none of that mattered once the drums began. This was not just an opening ceremony. It was a declaration. A message to the world: we are here. We are ready. And we are magnificent. Behind every flash of light, behind every meticulously choreographed movement, there were years of preparation. Thousands of rehearsals. Millions of workers. The bird's nest itself, a colossal lattice of steel and artistry, stood as a monument to human will, and to the power of design when it serves an idea larger than itself. The architects Herzog and de Meuron had dreamed of a stadium that was both fragile and strong, like China's own image at that time. It was the first stadium of its kind, a symbol, a sculpture, a statement. And when Li Ning, a former gymnast and Chinese national hero, was lifted into the air, running across the stadium roof with the Olympic flame in his hand, suspended against a sea of light, time seemed to stop. It was no longer about medals, records, or nations. It was about the story of a civilization finding its voice again. The flame burned, and with it began the games that would change everything. From that moment, the world felt different. The air seemed charged, not just with anticipation, but with the sense that history itself was unfolding before our eyes. The Beijing Olympics were not only a celebration of sport. They were a mirror, reflecting a new balance of power, a shifting world order, and the unstoppable rise of a new global era. For 16 days the old rules no longer applied. The East had become the center. But before the glory came the struggle. Before the spectacle there was silence, doubt, and danger. Beijing had fought for this moment, against pollution, politics, and the weight of expectation. When the city won the Olympic bid in 2001, China promised the world something extraordinary: a green Olympics, a high-tech Olympics, and a people's Olympics. It was a promise both ambitious and impossible. Beijing was one of the most polluted cities on Earth. Its air thick with coal dust, its streets crowded with 20 million lives. The idea of a green Olympics seemed absurd to many. But China had 7 years to transform itself. And it did. Factories were shut down. Highways were cleared. Construction crews worked day and night, reshaping an entire city. New subway lines. Parks. Stadiums. Villages. Roads. In 7 years, Beijing remade itself at the cost of billions, and the sweat of millions. It wasn't just a transformation of concrete and steel. It was the creation of a new image. For centuries, China had been seen through the lens of the past. Now it was crafting a vision of the future. But behind that gleaming vision lay control, a delicate choreography not unlike the opening ceremony itself. Every protest was silenced. Every voice of dissent muted beneath the rhythm of national pride. For China's leaders, this was more than a sporting event. It was a test of legitimacy, proof that they could command not just their people but the attention of the entire planet. And as the first competitions began, the athletes became instruments in this great symphony of spectacle and symbolism. Among them, one man would redefine perfection itself: Michael Phelps. The American swimmer entered Beijing with a goal no human had ever achieved: 8 gold medals in a single Olympics. To many it was a fantasy. To Phelps it was destiny. In the water cube, the shimmering blue aquatic center that looked like a cathedral of glass, he became more than an athlete. He became a myth. Each race was a battle against physics, exhaustion, and time itself. And yet, each time he emerged from the water, it seemed as though he had rewritten the boundaries of the human body. 8 races. 8 victories. 8 world records. The crowd cheered for him not as an American, but as a symbol of what humans could do when limits were merely suggestions. And on the track, under the burning lights of the bird's nest, another man prepared to make history. Usain Bolt, tall, loose, electric. The world had seen fast men before, but never like him. His confidence bordered on arrogance, his joy contagious. And when the gun fired in the 100 meters final, he didn't just win, he danced. 9.69 seconds. A new world record. And he did it easing up before the finish line, pounding his chest as the crowd erupted. Beijing had found its gods. But beneath the noise and glory, there were other stories, quieter, hidden in the margins of history. The tears of those who came close but not close enough. The sacrifices of athletes whose names would never appear on highlight reels. The volunteers who stood in the heat, smiling for hours, making sure the world saw perfection. The city's own people who had been displaced from their homes to make room for stadiums and roads, watching from the sidelines as the world applauded. It was a paradox, beauty built upon control, unity built upon silence. But perhaps that was the nature of these games, the collision of light and shadow, of pride and power. For all its controversies, Beijing 2008 was undeniable. It was too vast, too precise, too extraordinary to ignore. When the closing ceremony ended and the Olympic flame was extinguished, the world was not the same as before. China had arrived. The West had watched. And the future had changed course, quietly, irreversibly. The Olympic Games of Beijing were more than sport. They were prophecy. When the flame burned over Beijing, it wasn't just light that filled the sky, it was intention. Every firework, every synchronized movement, every polished smile was the manifestation of a dream that had been centuries in the making. The world watched the grandeur, but few understood the deeper purpose behind it. Beijing 2008 was not only a celebration of athleticism, it was the unveiling of a new narrative, China's vision of itself, and how it wanted the world to see it. For decades, the Olympic Games had been dominated by the voices and imagery of the West. Los Angeles, Athens, Sydney, cities where capitalism and freedom danced proudly before the cameras. But Beijing was different. This was not a celebration of individuality, it was a symphony of collective will. The harmony of 1 billion people orchestrated into one unstoppable rhythm. China's message was simple and yet powerful. We are organized. We are capable. We belong. The meticulous precision of the opening ceremony, where 2008 drummers struck their instruments in unison, became the perfect metaphor for the state itself. A portrait of national discipline so complete that even chaos bowed before it. To some, it was beautiful. To others, terrifying. But whether admired or feared, no one could look away. Behind the scenes, Western journalists marveled at the efficiency. Everything worked: transportation, security, infrastructure. There were no visible failures, no unplanned moments. Beijing had achieved what other host cities could only dream of: total control. And yet, within that perfection lay the paradox that would define the Games forever. For every medal won, there was an untold story of censorship. For every dazzling display, there was a neighborhood erased to make room for it. The human cost was hidden beneath layers of choreography. Still, the narrative was unstoppable. Beijing had delivered. The Games were a masterpiece of organization, a message written not in words but in spectacle. The Olympic motto, Citius Altius Fortius, had always spoken of the human drive to go faster, higher, stronger. In Beijing, those words took on new meaning. They described not only the athletes but a nation itself. In the gleaming venues that dotted the city, the bird's nest, the water cube, the Olympic green, every surface shone like a promise. The technology was cutting edge. The precision unmatched. Digital fireworks, electronic drumming, computer-guided pyrotechnics. Beijing 2008 wasn't just an event. It was the future performed live. And at the heart of it all was the human spirit, stretched and tested in every form. When Michael Phelps touched the wall for his 8th gold medal, the cameras caught a smile that would become immortal. 8 victories in 8 days. A feat so extraordinary that it seemed beyond the reach of mortality. He wasn't just swimming, he was bending time. His triumph became a metaphor for human potential, and for the perfection that Beijing had built its image upon. But in the stands, far above the swimming pool, a new conversation was taking shape. Politicians, economists, and journalists saw something deeper than medals. They saw a nation proving its dominance not through weapons but through spectacle, through culture, through the universal language of achievement. Soft power, that was the real gold medal. The Games had given China what no trade deal or military exercise ever could: admiration. Even those who criticized the regime could not deny what they had witnessed. Beijing had shown the world a different kind of greatness, one built on order, precision, and vision. For the Chinese people, pride swelled like a tide. Generations who had grown up in the shadow of economic struggle now saw their flag rise higher than ever before. The words "one world, one dream" echoed not only through stadiums but through the hearts of millions. It was a dream of unity, but also of legitimacy. A statement that China was not just a participant in global history, but its author. Outside the spotlight, the Games also sparked conversations that would shape the 21st century. The tension between freedom and control, between expression and uniformity, between individuality and collective destiny. Beijing 2008 became a mirror in which every nation saw its own reflection, its hopes, its contradictions, its fears. Meanwhile, on the field, the drama continued. Usain Bolt, the Jamaican sprinter, became the human embodiment of joy. Where others were tense, he smiled. Where others strained, he played. His long strides tore through the air as if the track itself could not hold him. When he crossed the finish line, chest out, arms wide, smiling to the heavens, he didn't just break a record. He broke the mold. In that moment, the world realized that greatness could be effortless. That power could look like play. Between Phelps and Bolt, the Games achieved something timeless. They turned athletes into myths. Each gold medal was a story. Each performance a parable. And yet, the Games were more than the sum of their heroes. They were a turning point in how the world communicated, connected, and consumed. Beijing 2008 was the first truly digital Olympics. High-definition broadcasts, instant online updates, social media whispers. The global audience was no longer passive. The Games lived in real time, shared by millions of keyboards and screens. The world had never been so connected. And Beijing had provided the stage. The contrast was striking. A nation famous for its censorship was now hosting the most interconnected event in human history. It was irony and evolution. Behind closed doors, Western governments and corporations took note. They saw not only China's capability but its ambition. The infrastructure, the technology, the control, it all pointed to something bigger than sport. The Olympics were the showcase. The message was geopolitical. China had arrived not as a factory of the world but as a power of destiny. And as the Games unfolded, that message resonated across continents. In Europe and America, the financial crisis was beginning to unfold, the old powers trembling under their own weight. Meanwhile, in Beijing, everything worked, everything shined. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a moment in time. It was a shift in gravity. When the world left Beijing after the closing ceremony, they carried with them more than souvenirs and memories. They carried a new awareness, that the center of the world had moved. That the balance of influence, economy, and culture was tilting, slowly but surely, toward the east. The Games had ended. But their echo was just beginning. When the last firework faded over the bird's nest, a strange silence fell upon Beijing. The crowds had gone home. The flags were being taken down. The athletes had vanished into history. Yet, something lingered in the air, a pulse, a memory, an afterglow that would not fade. For those who had lived through it, the Games felt like a dream. For China, they were proof of possibility. For the world, they were a question: what comes next? Beijing 2008 had shown perfection, a spectacle so grand that many wondered if it could ever be matched. The flawless synchronization, the glittering architecture, the near superhuman performances. It was as though humanity had reached its limit, standing at the edge of what civilization could achieve when discipline and ambition fused into one unstoppable force. But the story of Beijing did not end with its closing ceremony. In many ways it had just begun. In the years that followed, the bird's nest stood like a monument to human will. Some called it a masterpiece, others a ghost. The crowds were gone, but the structure remained, vast, silent, eternal. It was more than a stadium, it was a relic of a moment when time itself seemed to pause. And as China looked upon its creation, it saw both pride and burden. The Olympics had elevated the nation to new heights, but they had also raised expectations. The world now demanded greatness from China, not just in sport but in everything. The Games became a catalyst. They accelerated technology, infrastructure, and global perception. They redefined how the Olympics would be organized in the decades to come. Every host city that followed, London, Rio, Tokyo, would chase the ghost of Beijing, trying to capture even a fragment of its precision and power. But the true legacy of Beijing was not the architecture, nor the medals. It was the idea that the world had changed its axis. Before 2008, China was seen as an emerging power. After 2008, it was undeniable. Economically, it was already rising. But culturally, symbolically, emotionally, the Games had sealed its arrival. Beijing had done what no speech or summit could. It had told a story the world would never forget. In the quiet that followed, questions began to surface. Could a spectacle born of control truly represent unity? Could pride coexist with freedom? Could beauty be built upon silence? The answers were complex. But perhaps that was the point. The Olympics were never meant to resolve contradictions. They were meant to reveal them, to show the best and worst of what humanity could be when it reached for the extraordinary. In those 16 days, Beijing had embodied both the light and the shadow of progress. The power of a people united. And the price of that unity. For many in the West, the Games were a revelation, and a warning. They saw in China's precision a mirror of their own decline. They saw in its confidence the end of their monopoly on influence. In that sense, the Olympic flame in Beijing was more than symbolic. It was prophetic. It illuminated a future in which the old order would no longer reign. But amid the politics and predictions, there remained the human stories, the beating heart of every Olympic Games. The gymnast who fell and rose again. The marathoner who crossed the finish line long after the cameras turned away. The volunteers who smiled until their faces ached, proud to serve something greater than themselves. In the end, it was these small, quiet moments that made Beijing 2008 truly unforgettable. Because beyond the grandeur and power, the Games reminded the world of something simple. That greatness is not measured by dominance but by the courage to dream. And China had dreamed big. From the first spark of the torch to the final echo of the drums, Beijing 2008 was a testament to what humanity could achieve when vision meets will. It was not just the story of a nation, it was the story of an era. The 20th century had belonged to the West. The 21st perhaps began here, under the red banners of a rising East, illuminated by the flame of Olympus reborn. Years later, as new cities host the Games, as new heroes rise and fall, the shadow of Beijing still lingers. The bird's nest still stands, a silent witness to a moment when the world's gaze turned eastward, and stayed there. Some call it spectacle. Others call it propaganda. But history will remember it as transformation. Because Beijing 2008 was not merely about medals or nations. It was about identity, about the power of humanity to reshape itself, to build, to imagine, to declare, we are here. When the torch burned in Beijing, it burned for all of us, for the dreamers, the builders, the athletes, the believers. It reminded us that the Olympic spirit, though wrapped in politics and power, still belongs to the heart. And as the final ember dimmed against the night sky, the message of those Games remained clear. The world had not ended in conflict. It had met in harmony under one dream. One world. One dream. Forever changed. Long before the drums thundered in unison and the fireworks painted the sky, Beijing was a city under construction, not just of buildings but of identity. The year was 2001. When the International Olympic Committee announced that Beijing had won the bid to host the Games of the Sixth Olympiad, an eruption of joy swept through the nation. On the streets, people cheered, waved flags and cried tears of disbelief. It wasn't just about sports. It was about recognition. For the first time, China felt that the world had opened its arms, not in fear or suspicion but in respect. But behind the celebration the challenge was staggering. 7 years. That was all they had. 7 years to prepare a city, an infrastructure, and an image that would represent 5,000 years of civilization in just 16 days. The government called it the Great Leap Forward of modern times. Factories began to roar, cranes dotted the skyline, and highways stretched across the horizon like veins of steel. Entire districts were torn down and rebuilt. New subway lines cut through the earth. Millions of residents were relocated. For some, it was progress. For others, it was loss. Whole neighborhoods, hutongs that had stood for centuries, disappeared beneath bulldozers. The rhythm of old Beijing was replaced by the hum of machinery and ambition. The air grew thick with dust, the skyline obscured by the haze of rebirth. But to those directing the transformation the cost was justified. This was not just about hosting an event, it was about rewriting the nation's story. From the moment construction began, every detail was political. Every brick laid carried meaning. The bird's nest was not just a stadium, it was a symbol of unity and strength. The water cube was not just a pool, it was a metaphor for purity and flow. Even the Olympic Village, with its manicured lawns and modern apartments, was designed to reflect harmony between man and nature, an idealized vision of the new China. Tens of thousands of laborers worked through the night, sleeping in makeshift dormitories, living on hope and exhaustion. They were the invisible heroes of Beijing 2008, the ones whose sweat paved the future. They built under heat and smog, often with bare hands and limited protection. Accidents were frequent, but the deadlines were absolute. Every project was a race against time. Every delay a potential embarrassment. But in that pressure, something extraordinary emerged, an almost religious devotion to precision. The workers, engineers, and artists became part of a collective vision. It was not about individual glory, it was about belonging to something greater than oneself. And overseeing it all was the relentless hand of the state. Efficient, watchful, omnipresent. Pollution was the enemy. Beijing's skies were infamous, its air heavy with coal and dust. To create the Green Olympics they had promised, the government enacted one of the most ambitious environmental operations in modern history. Factories were shut down, cars were restricted by license plate numbers, and millions of trees were planted around the capital. The city became a living experiment, a test to see if human will could alter even nature itself. By 2008, the transformation was complete. Beijing gleamed. The streets were clean, the skies, if only briefly, were blue, and the world's media arrived to find a metropolis reborn. But behind the glass and steel, tension hummed beneath the surface. Every aspect of the games had been meticulously planned. Every performance, every camera angle, every note of music rehearsed until perfection became the norm. But perfection comes at a price. And the human spirit, when pressed too tightly, begins to bend. The opening ceremony, now remembered as one of the greatest in Olympic history, was the result of over a year of secret rehearsals. Directed by Zhang Yimou, one of China's most acclaimed filmmakers, it was a work of cinematic genius. But to achieve that scale, 15,000 performers moving in harmony, demanded control that bordered on the impossible. Some of the performers trained until their feet bled. Others fainted from exhaustion beneath the stadium lights. There was no room for error. Not a single beat could fall out of sync. And yet, on the night of August 8, 2008, it was flawless. From the ancient scrolls that unfurled to reveal living calligraphy, to the glowing drums that thundered like the heartbeat of a nation, it was pure visual poetry. What the world didn't see were the decisions behind the curtain, the political calculus, the hidden substitutions, the illusions created for perfection's sake. When a young girl named Lin Miaoka appeared to sing Ode to the Motherland, her sweet voice enchanted billions. But it wasn't her voice. The real singer Yang Pei had been deemed not cute enough for television. It was a small deception, but one that spoke volumes about the obsession with image. To China, the Olympics were not simply a stage. They were a test of pride. Every detail mattered because every detail was a reflection of the nation itself. And the world was watching. The pressure extended beyond Beijing. Across the provinces, factories worked overtime to produce souvenirs, uniforms, equipment. Security forces stood on constant alert. The internet was filtered, the media monitored, the streets lined with volunteers in red caps. A human buffer between the world and any hint of disorder. It was control on a scale that defied comprehension, and it worked. The games unfolded with astonishing precision. Visitors were amazed not just by the spectacle, but by the serenity of it all. There were no delays, no riots, no scandals, just a seamless display of order. But behind that serenity lay exhaustion. Many of those who had built the dream were left behind when the lights dimmed. Workers returned to their villages unnoticed and unthanked. The city, polished and proud, no longer had space for them. Still, the dream had been achieved. Beijing 2008 stood as proof that willpower could bend reality, that vision could move mountains, even if it meant burying the old world beneath them. And as the final days of preparation gave way to the dawn of the games, China stood ready. The roads were silent, the sky clear, the stadiums gleaming. The world was arriving and the stage was set. The drums waited in darkness. The torches burned quietly in their stands. And across the world, billions waited for a glimpse of the future. When the countdown began, 10, 9, 8, the collective breath of a billion people held steady. The bird's nest came alive in fire and thunder. And in that moment, all the years of labor, sacrifice, and silence condensed into one truth. Dreams, when backed by power, can change the course of history. Beijing had always been a city of contradictions, ancient and modern, poetic and political, sacred and restless. For centuries, its narrow hutongs had whispered the stories of emperors and revolutionaries, poets and peasants. The temples stood as witnesses to dynasties long vanished. The courtyards, shaded by old elms, carried the rhythm of a slower world. But as the 21st century approached, the city was called to become something new. It would no longer be the heart of an empire past. It would become the stage of a civilization reborn. The transformation began quietly, then grew into a roar. Dust rose from every corner as construction consumed the skyline. By 2008, the old Beijing, the Beijing of bicycles and tea houses, of alleyways and red lanterns, was vanishing beneath the weight of ambition. In its place rose a city of glass, concrete, and light. Skyscrapers sprouted beside ancient walls. The Forbidden City, once the seat of emperors, now stood at the center of a metropolis pulsating with traffic, neon, and movement. The Olympics had given Beijing a deadline, and a destiny. The government saw the Games not just as an event, but as a chance to redefine what the city could be. Every street was a statement, every building a metaphor. Where chaos once reigned, order was imposed. Where tradition lingered, modernity took root. Entire districts were remade. Roads widened. Parks appeared where old homes had stood. Millions were relocated, some compensated, many not. But in the official narrative, it was called progress. The slogan was everywhere, Beijing welcomes you. The city did not just prepare for visitors, it remade itself to impress them. Cleanup campaigns swept through neighborhoods. Old markets were replaced by sleek malls. Rivers were dredged, facades repainted, monuments restored. The gray tones of the past were brushed over with the optimism of red and gold. And amid it all, the people of Beijing adapted as they always had. Street vendors learned to smile for tourists. Taxi drivers memorized English phrases. Schools rehearsed the Olympic anthem. In every park, elderly residents practiced Tai Chi under banners celebrating the games. There was pride, genuine burning pride, that the world would finally see them, not through the lens of stereotypes, but as hosts of something beautiful. And yet, beneath that pride, an unease lingered. For some, the transformation felt like an erasure. The hutongs that once connected generations were vanishing. Memories were being paved over. Families displaced for the sake of progress watched the construction cranes rise from afar, unsure whether to feel pride or grief. The Beijing of 2008 was not the Beijing of memory. It was something new, dazzling, efficient but distant. Still, as the games approached, even the skeptics could not resist the current of excitement. There was something in the air, something vast, electric, inevitable. When the Olympic torch finally entered the city, winding through its streets, millions flooded the sidewalks to catch a glimpse. Some waved flags. Others simply watched in silence, aware that they were witnessing history. To host the world was to be seen. To be seen was to exist. The arrival of the athletes turned the city into a living mosaic of cultures. Languages intertwined, colors blended, music echoed through the Olympic village. For a few brief weeks, Beijing became not just China's capital but humanity's. And yet, behind the laughter and cameras, the invisible machinery of control continued to hum. Surveillance was everywhere, discreet but omnipresent. Security checkpoints, volunteers in uniform, cameras watching every crowd. Nothing was left to chance. The world saw the beauty, few saw the discipline that made it possible. For the people of Beijing, it was both liberation and confinement. The games opened their city to the world, but only in the way their leaders permitted. Still, the pride was undeniable. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders to watch fireworks bloom over the bird's nest. Couples walked hand in hand along the Olympic green, their faces glowing with reflected light. For one summer, Beijing shone brighter than any city on earth. And when night fell and the Olympic torch blazed above the stadium, even the cynics felt it. That quiet sense of wonder, that whisper that perhaps, for once, the world could come together not in war but in celebration. It didn't matter that the streets had been scrubbed clean or that the crowds were rehearsed. In those moments the illusion became real. The city, reborn and restless, pulsed with life. Beijing was no longer just a capital. It had become a symbol. The skyline itself seemed to speak, of ambition, of pride, of destiny. The bird's nest glowed like a heart. The water cube shimmered like a dream. Together they stood as monuments to what human hands could create, and what they could destroy. And though the world's cameras would soon move on, the people who walked those streets would never forget what it felt like to stand at the center of everything, to be, for one fleeting moment, the heartbeat of humanity. When the fireworks faded, and the night returned to its quiet hum, Beijing exhaled. The city had survived the transformation. It had paid its price and it had won its place. The Games were not just a sporting event. They were a resurrection. Every Olympic Games is political, though it pretends not to be. Athletes compete in the name of peace, but nations compete in the name of pride. And in 2008, no nation understood that better than China. For the Chinese leadership, the Olympics were never simply about sport. They were about legitimacy, the validation of an idea that had been in motion since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. For nearly 6 decades, China had worked to rise from humiliation to power, from isolation to influence. Beijing 2008 was the moment that journey would be seen by the entire world. Behind closed doors in the corridors of Zhongnanhai, the walled compound of China's leaders, preparations for the Games were not just logistical. They were ideological. The narrative had to be perfect. No protests. No failures. No flaws. The slogan chosen, "One World, One Dream," carried the simplicity of idealism. But its true purpose was far more complex. It was a bridge designed to soften the West's perception of China and to reintroduce the nation not as a threat, but as a partner, powerful, disciplined, yet benevolent. To achieve that, the state mobilized every resource it had. Media outlets were instructed to maintain optimism. Schools were told to teach Olympic spirit. Citizens were urged to behave with dignity as the hosts of humanity. For once, ideology took a backseat to image. But while Beijing polished its streets and smiles, the rest of the world whispered. Human rights. Tibet. Freedom of speech. Censorship. The Olympic flame that burned so brightly on Chinese soil was shadowed by protests across Europe, America, and Asia. When the torch relay began, that sacred journey from Olympia to the host city, it turned into a battlefield of symbolism. In London, Paris, and San Francisco, protesters tried to extinguish the flame, waving flags of Tibet, chanting for freedom. China's state media called it an insult. Western critics called it truth. Between the two, the Olympic ideal trembled. And yet the flame endured. Protected by security and pride, it reached Beijing, its light untarnished. To China, this became proof of resilience. To others, proof of control. Inside the bird's nest, the cameras saw harmony. Outside, the conversation was far more divided. The games had exposed the line between admiration and fear, between the world's fascination with China's power and its discomfort with how that power was wielded. But China did not flinch. Its leaders knew that spectacle had a language of its own. A single image could rewrite 1,000 headlines. And Beijing 2008 was built entirely on images. The rows of perfectly synchronized drummers. The children carrying the national flag with solemn grace. The fireworks bursting across the Great Wall. Each moment was calculated not as propaganda but as persuasion, an appeal to emotion so grand that logic could not compete. It worked. Even those who criticized China's politics found themselves speechless before the beauty of its performance. Beijing had achieved what few nations could. It had made the world admire it, even if only for a moment, on its own terms. In the months before the Games, Western media had been filled with stories of censorship and repression. But when the Games began, the narrative changed. Suddenly, headlines praised the efficiency, the architecture, the artistry. For 2 weeks, China had rewritten its image. It was no longer a developing power. It was the future. Yet the irony was sharp. The same control that made the Games flawless also silenced voices that might have made them human. Every protest zone was empty. Every critical journalist carefully managed. And when foreign broadcasters arrived, their movements were guided, their access limited, their reports monitored. But perfection has a price, and China paid it willingly. In the eyes of its leaders, disorder was worse than criticism. And so the city moved like clockwork, immaculate, obedient, breathtaking. The balance between openness and control was delicate and deliberate. The government allowed a glimpse of freedom but never the substance of it. For foreign visitors, Beijing was a wonder of hospitality. For locals, it was a test of discipline. The people played their roles beautifully. Volunteers smiled endlessly. Children waved flags until their arms ached. Citizens lined the streets with banners and songs. Every detail was a brushstroke in a painting of national unity. To many in the West, it was an unsettling beauty, too precise, too perfect. But to those who understood China's history, its long struggle to restore dignity after a century of humiliation, it was catharsis. For the first time in modern memory, China stood not as the world's factory, not as the silent power behind the curtain, but as the star on the stage. And it demanded to be seen not as imitation, but as creation. When world leaders gathered in the VIP box of the bird's nest, the symbolism was unmistakable. George W. Bush, Vladimir Putin, Nicolas Sarkozy. They sat beneath a red flag rising above them, the 5 stars of China shining under a sky filled with fireworks. It was as if history itself had reversed. For centuries, China had bowed to Western power. Now the West sat in China's house. The message was subtle but clear. The age of observation was over. The age of participation had begun. Beijing 2008 marked the moment China entered not just the global economy, but the global imagination. Through spectacle, it achieved what politics could not. And though the controversies would return, about Tibet, censorship, pollution, they would return to a different world. A world where China could not be ignored. The Games had given China what it desired most: recognition, respect, and inevitability. For the athletes who competed, the medals were symbols of excellence. For China, the Games themselves were the medal. The closing ceremony, directed once again by Zhang Yimou, sealed that message in light and color. When the flame finally dimmed, China stood taller than it had in generations. And though the world might debate the meaning of its power, it could no longer deny its presence. The bird's nest became a temple not to sport but to narrative. And in that temple China had written its story, one the world would read for decades. Every Olympic Games has its legends. But Beijing 2008 created gods. For 16 days humanity witnessed what seemed impossible. Records fell like dominoes. History bent beneath the weight of human will. The stadiums became temples, the athletes their prophets. And at the center of it all stood a man who seemed born from water itself. Michael Phelps. The American swimmer arrived in Beijing with a mission so audacious that many called it madness. 8 gold medals, 8 world records in a single Olympic Games. No one had ever done it. No one had ever dared to try. He was already a legend after Athens 2004, but this was something different. This was destiny. Inside the water cube, a building that shimmered like liquid light, Phelps became a force beyond comprehension. Each race was a lesson in precision, discipline, and pain. His arms sliced through the pool like blades. His face betrayed nothing. He swam not against opponents but against the idea of human limitation itself. The world watched, hypnotized. And as the days passed, the impossible unfolded. 1 gold. 2. 3. 4. Then came the race that nearly broke the dream, the 100-meter butterfly. The Serbian swimmer Milorad Čavić touched the wall almost at the same time. For a heartbeat, the scoreboard hesitated. Then it appeared, Phelps gold. 50.58 seconds. He had won by 0.01 seconds, a single finger's reach between immortality and loss. By the time he claimed his 8th gold medal, surpassing Mark Spitz's record, the world was no longer watching a man. It was watching a myth in motion. Phelps didn't just win. He embodied the relentless pursuit of perfection that defined Beijing itself. Discipline, endurance, control. He was, in every sense, the human reflection of the Games. And while Phelps ruled the water on the track, another miracle was preparing to unfold. Usain Bolt. The man from Jamaica who ran like joy itself. The world had seen sprinters before, powerful, explosive, determined, but Bolt was something else. He was loose, smiling, playful. His movements seemed effortless, almost lazy until the gun fired. Then the air cracked. In the bird's nest, under the gaze of 91,000 spectators, Bolt surged forward like lightning incarnate. His strides devoured the track. His arms flung wide before the finish line, chest high, face radiant. 9.69 seconds. A new world record. But it wasn't the time that made it legendary, it was the moment. As he pounded his chest, slowing before the line, he broke more than a record. He broke the image of what victory was supposed to look like. Where others strained, he celebrated. Where others feared failure, he laughed. The world saw not arrogance, but liberation, the joy of pure, unfiltered greatness. Bolt would return days later for the 200 meters, destroying another world record. And then again anchoring the Jamaican relay team to gold. 3 events. 3 world records. The world had found its hero of light, to match Phelps, the hero of discipline. 2 men from opposite worlds, representing different philosophies, had come to embody the dual soul of Beijing 2008, precision and freedom, order and joy. But they were not alone. Every corner of the Games offered its own miracle. In gymnastics, under the blinding lights of the National Indoor Stadium, the duel between Nastia Liu and Shawn Johnson captivated millions. Liu, elegant, ethereal, the artist. Johnson, powerful, resilient, the warrior. Their rivalry was poetic, each performance a dialogue between grace and strength. When Liu floated through her final floor routine, her lines perfect, her movements serene, she seemed to defy gravity. When the scores came in and her gold medal was confirmed, her tears became a symbol of everything that makes the Olympics transcendent, the beauty of sacrifice fulfilled. And then there was Yelena Isinbayeva, the Russian pole vaulter whose confidence was legendary. Under the bright Beijing night, she played with the world's nerves. She waited, smiling as her competitors fell one by one. Then with a single leap, she soared beyond them all, breaking her own world record once again. She didn't just win. She performed victory like a masterpiece. On the basketball court, the Redeem Team of the United States, LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade, arrived with a mission to restore American dominance. 4 years earlier in Athens, the U.S. had fallen. Beijing was their redemption. Their final against Spain was a war disguised as a game. The score swung back and forth. Every shot, every rebound felt like history hanging in balance. Then in the closing minutes, Kobe Bryant, the Black Mamba, rose. He hit a three-pointer, drew a foul, and screamed to the heavens, "This is what we came for." The crowd erupted. The gold returned to the United States. The legacy of failure was erased. In the marathon, another story unfolded, one that echoed through the soul of the games. A tall Ethiopian named Samuel Wanjiru, just 21 years old, ran through the humid Beijing heat with a pace that defied belief. He broke the Olympic record and collapsed across the finish line, exhausted and triumphant. For a nation that had given the world so many distance legends, Wanjiru's run was a new chapter in their mythology, a symbol of endurance in a furnace of will. And yet, not all victories were measured in gold. There were stories whispered in the quiet corners of the Olympic Village, of athletes who fought illness, poverty, or exile just to be there. They did not win medals, but they won something greater: visibility. They proved that the Olympic dream still belonged to everyone, not just the powerful. Beijing, for all its grandeur and control, could not suppress the raw humanity that sport brings. The smiles, the tears, the trembling hands before a race, these were moments no government could script. And perhaps that was the true power of the games. Amid the spectacle, the politics, and the precision, there remained an element that no system could command: the human spirit. When Usain Bolt stood on the podium, laughing as the Jamaican anthem played, and Michael Phelps raised his hand, exhausted but radiant, the cameras caught more than victory. They caught the eternal truth of the Olympics, that greatness in its purest form belongs to everyone, not to a nation, not to a system, but to the soul that dares to rise. For 16 days, Beijing was the center of the world. And its heroes, like ancient gods, left footprints that would never fade. The games were not only about who won, but about what it meant to win, and what it cost to get there. The medals would tarnish. The records would fall. But the memory of that summer, of speed, of water, of light, would remain eternal. Beijing had shown the future of sport. And its heroes had shown the future of humanity. For every roar that echoed through the bird's nest, there was a whisper that the cameras never caught. For every medal raised to the sky, there were thousands of hands that made it possible. Hands unseen, names unspoken, faces forgotten. They were the builders who worked through sleepless nights, shaping steel and stone into symbols of glory. They were the volunteers who guided crowds with tired smiles, their red uniforms shining under a sun that refused to relent. They were the mothers and fathers who sold what little they had to send a child to the games, just to stand in the presence of greatness. The world never knew them, but Beijing remembered. As the athletes became immortal, the people became invisible. And yet, perhaps that was how it was always meant to be: the few carried by the many, the extraordinary resting upon the shoulders of the ordinary. In a narrow alley near the old drum tower, an old man watched the fireworks from his rooftop. His home had survived the demolitions, though the neighborhood around it had not. As the sky filled with light, he whispered to himself, "We did it." He didn't mean the government. He didn't mean the athletes. He meant the people, those who had endured the dust, the noise, the endless work. The ones who built a dream they would never own. There were athletes, too, whose names barely appeared in the headlines, yet whose journeys embodied the Olympic soul more than any gold medal ever could. The refugee runners from Sudan who trained barefoot in camps, finding in Beijing not a podium but dignity. The North Korean gymnasts who bowed before empty seats, smiling through rehearsed tears. The Uzbek weightlifter who lifted more than iron. He lifted the hopes of a forgotten village. These were the real games, unseen, unrecorded, unremembered. Because the Olympics, for all their grandeur, are not built upon victory alone. They are built upon struggle, upon the countless defeats that pave the road to triumph. And Beijing 2008, for all its control and perfection, could not contain the raw humanity that leaked through its flawless surface. Somewhere, amid the precision of the ceremonies and the thunder of applause, there was still imperfection, and in that imperfection, truth. The truth that the world, though divided by power and politics, can still share a moment of awe. That beneath flags and anthems, we are bound by the same pulse, the desire to rise, to reach, to belong. And when the final day arrived, when the torches flickered and the last notes of the Olympic anthem echoed through the stadium, a quiet sadness filled the air. Because everyone knew, something extraordinary was ending. The athletes embraced. The spectators wept. The city, exhausted and triumphant, began to exhale. As the flame dimmed in the bird's nest, Li Ning, the same gymnast who had soared across the sky 16 days earlier, stood once more beneath the glow of history. The cauldron that had burned like a star above Beijing was now fading to embers. And with it an era ended. But the echo of those games did not vanish. It traveled, through time, through nations, through every heart that had watched in wonder. Because Beijing 2008 was more than a date on a calendar. It was the moment humanity looked east and saw its reflection. Disciplined, dazzling, imperfect, alive. The games left behind more than buildings and memories. They left questions. Questions about power and beauty, about freedom and control, about what it means to be united in a divided world. And perhaps that was the true triumph of Beijing. Not the spectacle, not the medals, but the dialogue it began. A dialogue that continues today, every time the torch is lit, every time an anthem rises, every time a human being dares to believe in something greater than themselves. Years will pass. Records will fall. Cities will host new games, brighter, faster, louder. But the shadow of Beijing will always remain. Because for 16 days in 2008, the world stopped fighting and started watching, together. And in that fragile, fleeting unity, something sacred was born. The bird's nest still stands empty now, its steel ribs glowing faintly under the night sky. The wind moves through its hollow corridors like a whisper of memory. It waits, not for another crowd but for remembrance. And somewhere inside, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo of drums, the cheer of nations, the heartbeat of humanity at its finest hour. In the end, Beijing did not just host the games. It redefined them. It showed the world that spectacle could be art, that discipline could be beauty, and that even power, when wrapped in light, could inspire rather than intimidate. The Olympics of 2008 were not perfect. They were human. And perhaps that is why they endure. Because long after the medals tarnish and the banners fade, the memory remains, of a world united under one flame, if only for a moment. One world. One dream. Beijing 2008, the games that changed the world.